So this is the first challenge for the collections. This is what the screen should look like on a desktop by the time you're done. Notice that we have a series of images here. There are 2 rows with 3 columns each. They have different color borders associated with them. Notice that we have the figure caption here overlapping the image, just like we did in the previous CodePen. So that is what it should look like there at desktop. When we go to tablet, it's going to be 2 images across. And when we go to mobile, it's going to be a series of images in a column. So go on ahead and give that a try. Hope you did okay on the collections. Let's go through exactly how these are going to work, how I coded them. As always, there's lots of different ways to approach these problems, so you might have come up with something slightly different, but I'll tell you about how I address this particular problem. So if we take a look at our HTML here, what I've done is the following. I've set this up, first of all, inside of a section. Rather than using a div, I've set this up as a section. The reason why is because this is a section of the web page that happens to be talking about collections. You could have used a div tag here if you wanted. It's less meaningful. I understand that the accessibility of section is kind of hit or miss in terms of whether screen readers actually understand the section element, but I decided to use it anyway. Anytime you have a section, you need a heading, so there it is, H2. My assumption is, of course, that somewhere on the page there will eventually be an H1, which is why I started with H2. And then this is a list of pictures, and so this is marked up as a list. Inside of each list item is our figure. And these are more or less marked up the way you've seen in several examples prior to this. So there's a figure tag, there's an image, and then there's a figure caption inside of each of these. I wound up assigning classes to each one of these figures, and that class is numbered color 7, color 2, and so forth. That's actually going to match back to our CSS. So that is the HTML markup that I used here. On the CSS side, let's go through that. So I started off giving you the series of colors that are here inside of this example for the page that we're building. And the designer gave me 10 different colors. So I just set them all up, numbered 1 to 10, and there are all of the values. You could, if you know how to use CSS, custom properties, or variables as they're often called, you can explicitly call on these colors inside of your code. If you're not familiar with that code, just take the hex codes and drop them into your CSS, and that will work just fine also. As I mentioned earlier, I have not made extensive use of variables inside of this course, again, because this is more targeted towards beginners who are just starting out, and I'm trying to keep this as straightforward as possible. But clearly you could do more with variables in the work that I've done here. All right, so then we have our basic border box styling. We have some basic styling here for our body, setting up our background color and our font and turning off the padding and margin. And I set a max width on our section such that we won't go wider than 1200 pixels, just so the screen doesn't get ridiculously large, and set up some margin and some padding on that, as well as a font size. Now we're going into our new styles. So as always, the first step anytime you're using markup like this is to turn off the bullets. It is set up as a list because that is semantically what this is, just a list of images. And of course, those come with bullets. So we turn those off. Then, as I say here, to keep the mobile screens from being stupid long, consider setting a max height on the images and then hide the overflow. Because otherwise you might wind up with images that may take up even more than one screen on a phone. So you might really indeed want to set a max width and then just hide that overflow, which is what I've done here. We've got a bit of margin on these to put a bit of separation on them, and I set up a tiny little bit of a border radius, and then notice that I spelled out individually my border width and my border style. Normally we see this as like border 1 pixel solid red. Here I've spelled it out in 2 separate declarations because that border color I've associated with those classes later on. So by default, my figure will come with a border that has a width and a style, but it does not have a color, and the color will be added on later. Okay. In between the figure and the caption, I think there's this tiny little space that shows up. We saw it in a previous example. Here I've just used margin bottom of a -4 pixels to tighten that up. And I've set this up to have the object fit property and the object position property. This has to do with how the images are displaying inside of the web page here. When you set your max height on those pictures, they'll just take the top 400 pixels of the picture. Sometimes the interesting parts of the picture are down towards the bottom. So what this is doing is it's pushing up the visible portion of the picture so that we can see it a little bit better, and we're cropping off parts that are less interesting by default. We also have styling here for our figure caption. I talked to you previously about relative and absolute positioning, and so we've done something very similar here with that. And we've set a background color with a bit of transparency to it. Yes, we have a question.
Why do we need position relative here?
Why do we need position relative here? Here we have not used Flexbox to lay out the inside of this particular figure. We're just using absolute and relative positioning in this particular case. So that's why we need it here. Then we have our figure caption A. We want to have a big clickable area with display block. Okay, remember that by default, your links are an inline type of configuration. They're only as wide as their content. They're only as wide as their text. And so people can easily miss that clickable area. Make it really big, set it to display block, give it a color, and that will give us a great big huge target area. Very helpful on phones in particular, can't hurt on desktop. Okay. Then I set up a whole bunch of these styles, which have a really weird combination of both border color and text color. These are to set up the colors inside of our borders on the figure, as well as some of the colors inside of the text inside of that document. So that is what all of this is, and we're just calling on the colors as configured earlier in the document. So there's a whole bunch of those. Then we get to our media queries. Here is the first place that we turn on our media query at 550 pixels. And I've talked you through this several times. Display flex, flex flow is row wrap, justify content is space between. So my favorite configuration right there. And then we'll set each LI to have a flex basis of 49.5%. I didn't make use of the gap property here. You absolutely could have used the gap property if you wanted, but by virtue of having two elements next to each other, each is 49.5%, add them together, you get like 99%, so you'll get a 1% gap by default in between those two items. And then I turn off the object positioning once we get to the larger screens. Otherwise, what you'll see is half of the image and half of it will be cut off. You'll just have blank space. So we have to turn that off here to pull everything down a little bit further. And then finally here, for my last media queries, I'm just turning on a little bit of an indent and setting up a 1/3 size for our flex basis property for that LI. So let's take a quick look at the web page and see how it looks. So here's our web page. Hopefully yours looks pretty much like this, and we'll scrunch it down so you can see how it changes. One of the things you want to be mindful of when you're working with images like this is how much of the image is showing, and so that's where that object position property comes in. These still look pretty good. Then we go to our tablet dimension. So you can see here, for example, this landscape image, it may be worthwhile to tweak that a little bit more, maybe with a class, because you know, the interesting part is the mountains interacting with the moon here, and that is not really coming across here at this particular dimension. So that might be something you wanted to develop a little bit further. And then we'll go to mobile, and you'll see here, so that max width of 400 pixels, which obviously could be a smaller number. Now you see we get a sense of these pictures that's not the full picture, and because we've pushed these up a little bit, we get the interesting parts of the picture. So like this one here called Vivid, you would see a lot of sky without pushing the picture up a little bit further, or you'd see just the neck of the guitar without seeing the main body of the guitar. So that's how that winds up turning out.
Jen, could you differentiate between the min width and max width in the case of media queries?
Yes. So when you are writing mobile first, what you want to do is use all min width media queries the whole way through. So you start with your declarations outside of the media queries. That's your mobile styles. And then you're going to change whatever needs changing through the media queries. And you use min width because that pulls in the styles outside the media query, pulls those styles. They're still valid when you get into the next media query. And they are still valid all the way through the document until you reset a value somewhere along the way. So that is min widths. Max widths are what you would use if you wanted to go desktop first. In other words, all the styles outside of it are desktop styles, and then we're going to cut off whatever those styles are at various breakpoints by using max width media queries. Generally speaking today, people write mobile first for the most part, but sometimes desktop first may make sense. You may be starting from, there's still a few websites around that are not responsive, and so you might be rewriting styles that already exist and you're tacking on the mobile part of it. That would be a situation where you might go desktop first. Or maybe you just have a complicated desktop website and it made more sense to go that way. Or maybe that's where most of your traffic is. It's on your desktop site. The mobile site is less important, and so it makes sense to use desktop first for that reason.
That was object position or object fit?
Object fit will determine how the image is going to display within the space, like cover or contain, or there's a scale down one. You can kind of play around with those properties to see their impact, but the object position moves things actually up and down and side to side in space. So you may need to play around with a combination of both of those to get the images to look right.